Hi there, welcome back to Diagonal Move. My name's Neil. Today I'm going to do a rules overview for 1565 St Elmo's Pay, which is a two-player historical card game set during the 1565 Siege of Malta, in which the Ottoman Turks and the Knights of St John fought for control of the island. The game is a two-player game, however there are full solo rules, and I will have a quick look at those and the differences between those and the two-player game at the end of the video. But first, what we'll do is have a quick look at some of the components, just to give you a sense of what's inside the box. So simply starting with the tokens, because there's less of those. We have a two-sided first player marker. There are these red and green teardrop shaped tokens which act as damage markers, and you place those on the cards at certain points in the game. And then you have these attribute tokens which give you a plus or minus to either your zeal, which is the cross shape, or to your might, which is the cannon. And you would place those on the cards in order to note the modifiers for the particular card in question. Okay, the most important thing in the game by far is the cards. And there's a number of different types of cards which we have down the bottom here currently, and I'll go through them in turn. We have three cards here: Burgu, Senglia, I think that's correct, and St Elmo. These are what's called frontiers, and they go in the centre of the board from left to right. Appreciate I'm going upwards because of the narrowness of my table, but they would appear in the centre of the board like that. And it's always St Elmo, Senglia, and then Burgu. That's the format. And these are known as frontiers. And these are the three places in Malta which major battles were fought, and your game will be centred around control of these three frontiers. The next set of cards, and there's a set each, are what's called the objectives, and the aim of the game is to complete each of these objectives in turn until finally you get to the Great Siege of Malta. There are a number of pieces of information on the cards. There's some flavour text, and with the exception of the first one, there is an effect when you complete the objective. There is a letter, and these are in alphabetical order running from A through to G. You do not have to play them in alphabetical order each time you play the game. However, G is always the last objective you'll try to complete, and when you reach the Great Siege of Malta objective, you then start to deal damage to these frontiers. The frontiers do have damage markers on them, whereas there's a teardrop sign. That means that has eight damage required in order to capture or win at that frontier. And similarly, we have damage markers on the objectives, which represent the amount of damage you will need to conquer those objectives or to complete the objectives. There was also a zeal and a might icon, and I'll get more into the detail of how you complete the objectives shortly. But you do have to complete these ones before you can move on to the Great Siege of Malta. And these objectives are different for each player. This is an asymmetrical game, so while they do run the same alphabetical order, they are different objectives with slightly different requirements for each. The main focus of the game is going to be the cards, and you have a deck of cards each. These individual player decks of cards, and they are different. They are asymmetrical, although there are a number of similarities in each deck, and I'll go through the different card types with you now. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of the different card types, and we'll start with what's called the leaders. Each of these cards is unique. There are only two in the game, and one for each side, the red being Knights of St John, green being the Turks, and they are represented by this crown symbol here. There's some flavour text and an action on each one. there is a rosette and then some information down the side. We have those symbols for zeal, might, and then the health again. These numbers represent the amount of each that you have. So this character has 3 zeal, 3 might, and 9 health. Once you hit 9 health, so 9 of these tokens placed on the card, the character, or the leader, sorry, is dead, and the game has ended. That's one of the several ways to win the game. Additionally, we have a range of other cards, and each card will, broadly speaking, have a similar set of information down the side, which is firstly the cost. In the rosette there's a 3, hopefully it focuses, and that is the cost of this card. You would need to pay 3 resources to play this card. You then have zeal, might, health, so this one will only take 2 damage before it's destroyed. It then has a unit type, in this case it's the navy, and then some cards have a green rosette which indicates the amount of resources these cards will generate. I'll get back to that in a moment. And then there is an effect or an action that could be taken. And finally, there is some flavour text at the bottom. So the different card types, you have the navy, there are cavalry. These are events which are played from your hand. There are tactics which are played at the back of what's known as your sort of army display, which I'll show you shortly. Characters. Now, characters are quite important. They are the people in charge of your army. They are not the same as leaders. Leaders are unique. You only have one of these in your deck. If they are killed, you lose the game. However, characters, the game does not end. They simply get destroyed like any other card. A leader, which is this one, is a character, but a character is not a leader. Quite an important distinction to make. Moving on from characters, we do have the infantry. There are ranged or riflemen, there's artillery, and then there is attachments. Attachments are slightly different to the others in the sense that they are played with other cards, as you might expect. So to set the game up, the Ottoman player will play first. They always play first, and the first thing you'll need to do is you will need to place your leader card into one of the 3 frontiers. You can place it in any of the 3 frontiers that you choose, and for this I will play the leader Mustafa Pasha into the Sanglia frontier. Then the Knights of St. John will place Jean Parisot de Valette into a frontier on their side of the board, or their side of the table. They do not have to play the same frontier as the Ottomans, but for demonstration I will leave it in the first row, and from here the rows will be built out. Then what will happen is you'll each draw 4 cards, and you will get 1 chance to shuffle your cards back into your deck if you don't like them. Just the 1 chance, that's 1 chance each. When you're both happy with your deck of cards, or your initial card draw, you will draw 2 new cards. Now you only get 1 opportunity to draw your hand of cards. So if you don't like the second time, you will be stuck with what you've got. Having done this though, you will then take 2 additional cards from the deck. Your hand limit is 6. If ever you have more than 6 after drawing 2 cards, you will discard down to 6. The game has 4 phases: preparation, deployment, frontier and objective, and you'll play those in order. The preparation phase is first, and the first thing you'll do is check for victory. Does one player or more have no cards left in their deck? If one player has no cards remaining in their deck, the opposite player will win. If both players have no cards, the game is a draw. Then you'll move on to your draw phase. your draw step of the preparation phase, and this is where you draw those 2 cards and discard down to 6 if you had more than 6. And then you do what's referred to as ready. And cards are either ready, as in the case of Mustafa Pasha here, or they are tired. I'll come on to tired in a moment. What you need to do is any cards that were tired from the previous round, you need to ready them. Then is the deployment phase, and there are 4 things you can do during the deployment phase. You can pass. If you choose to pass, there is nothing else you can do until the opposing player has also passed. You can play a card, you can execute an action, or you can sacrifice a card. Now what you'll need to do in order to play a card is pay its cost in resources. So for example, let's just, for hypothetical purposes, say I want to play this card, the Spaffis, yeah, I think that's right. And this costs 2. In order to play this card, I need to pay 2 resources, and there's a couple of ways I can do that. The first one is to discard an equivalent number of cards from hand. So if I need 2 resources, I can discard 2 cards from hand. Each card would be worth a resource. Worth noting though, that cards do not come back into your hand during the game. The other option that I've got, if I have any, I'll just have to find some, if I have any cards in play that have resources on them, that green symbol, I can tire a card in order to generate the resources stated. So in this case, I can just tire one card and discard another in order to pay for this card. And what you'll do is you'll play it in one of the rows in your display, and over a period of time, what will happen is you'll end up with a 3x3 grid. Both players will do this on their turn. Once you've played one card or taken one action or sacrificed, it's then the other player's turn. So what would you do if you wanted to execute an action? And I'll just demonstrate this. You would need to depending on which card, what you have, the actions do different things. I'll just change that one. That doesn't, like that. The cards will have on them or possibly have on them a different action. I won't go into the nuances of every single action, but some will be an attack card. You can do damage to the other player. Some will be, for example, the Mustafa Pasha will allow you to move a unit from a frontier to another frontier. And in order to do that, you have to have space. So for example, we can't move a unit at the moment, but should we have a space, you could potentially move like that. Now, if you were to move, let's say we were to move this card to here, you would have to move your cards down the rows to fill in all the gaps. And the action card that you've used to perform that action would then be tired. And that's true of whether you do any action that you do. The next possible option you've got is to sacrifice a card, and this is a way of clearing out your display. So if you don't want this card, for example, you simply put it in the discard pile, slide the card down, and that card is now discarded. As your game progresses, the display will start to look something like this, and you will finish the deployment phase when both players have passed. Then you will look to the frontier phase. Now this third phase, the frontier phase, will only take place if at least one player has completed all their objectives, with the exception of the Great Siege of Malta. If this card is showing for either player, then the frontier phase will happen. If nobody has reached that frontier, nobody has reached the Great Siege of Malta, the frontier phase will not happen. And so you will look instead to the objective phase. And I'll cover the details of the objective phase first because it's very similar but slightly simpler than the frontier phase. And you do need to do this phase more often at the beginning of the game than the frontier phase. So let's say everyone's passed and you are now faced with the topmost card on your objective display. The first card you'll come across, or usually the first card you'll come across, is a slight exception. It's called the Siege of Rhodes in the case of the Ottomans, and there is no requirement to destroy it. It's automatically destroyed. That card is an exception to the rule. More typically, you'll find something like this, the Nest of Vipers. And this is where the might and the health come in. This card has a combat factor for might of 2. In order to deal damage to this card, you will need to have a might of greater than 2, and then you will take the difference between your score and the score in here and deal that level of damage to the card. So what does that mean? Well, each of these cards do have those might numbers on them. So here's this one's 2, this one's 4. You'll add all the cards on your display that are ready. So in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4 cards that are ready. We'll add up all the might and then deduct the might of this card, and the difference is the damage. So in this case we have 6, 8, 10. And so that is going to be 8 damage, which we'll place on the card. And in this case, 8 damage will destroy the Nest of Vipers. Once you have destroyed that objective, it's placed to one side, and the next time you do the objective phase, you will face the next card in your objective deck. If you do not deal enough damage to destroy the objective, any damage you do will stay until the next round. And both players will do this in turn, with whoever is currently the first player as the person who goes first. Should you defeat the objective, you will then do the action that it says, or the effect will take place. These are not always beneficial, depending on which side you are on. Now, let's say once you finish the objective phase, you will then go to the next round, change first player and so on. But let's say we are at the Siege of Malta, and we finished our deployment phase, and we are now at the Siege of Malta. Should one player have the Great Siege of Malta card showing on their objective deck, you will perform a frontier phase after deployment but before the objective phase. What this means is, and it's slightly different depending on whether one or both players is at the Great Siege of Malta, but in each of these frontiers, so each of the 3, you will compare zeal values on ready cards. Okay, so for example here we have at Burgu we have a zeal of 1 with this card, Captain Miranda, but no other cards. Here we have 2 ready cards with a combined value of 1 and 1 tired card which we do not use for this combat. They are drawn, and because they are drawn, they will both put 1 damage on the frontier. Now, should both players have had a zeal of 0, a total zeal of 0, no one would do any damage to the frontier. If, as in this case, the one player was not at the Great Siege of Malta, they would not be able to do any damage to the frontier, even if they were to win the zeal combat. What they would simply do is prevent the opponent from putting the zeal on the frontier. Okay, so in this particular example, the Ottomans would have had a point of damage, but the Knights of St. John would not. And then you move to the objective phase, where the player who is not at the Great Siege of Malta would then try to go through the objectives to get to the Great Siege of Malta. Once both players are at the Great Siege of Malta, you would have another step before the zeal combat, which is called the might combat. And it's very similar except that rather than comparing the zeal, you compare the might. And so, for example, you would have 3 versus 6, and the difference, and this is where things do start to become different, the difference between the two would be what's placed on the card. And then you do a zeal combat, and then you would move to the new round and the deployment phase. The player who places tokens onto a frontier to the value that it states, so in the case of Burgu that's 12, they would win the frontier. First person to win 2 frontiers wins the game. Much of the subtlety in 1565 comes from when and how you use the card effects. The process of generating resources, completing the objectives, tackling each other at the frontier is relatively straightforward. The interaction between the card effects is where the meat of the game really is. And while I won't go through every single action or effect of each of the cards, there are a few that it's worth pointing out before we go into any kind of playthrough later. The first one of those is Relentless. So let's say for a moment we have our discard pile. Normally, when a card is discarded to a discard pile, you don't use it anymore. However, when it says Relentless, unless you have sacrificed the card, you can play it from the top of your deck, from the top of your discard pile, without needing to cover it up with resources. So if you wanted to play that card, which was 3, had a cost of 3, you can discard all 3 resources, play the card, and play the card from the discard. It's quite an important effect. The other is Tactics. These are this feather, and they do not count towards your display. They don't count towards your hand. They sit at the back of your, I appreciate you probably can't see that, but they sit at the back of your army display, and you can use them as needed. And each of these will have a different effect or ability on them. For example, this has a resource. It also has what's known as a response, and responses are something that you can play when your opponent plays a card. So they're played out of turn sequence. So let's say, for example, our artillery here has fired at the Ottomans, and so for the purposes of the Knights of St. John, they would do what the card says, which is deal damage to the card and then damage every enemy in the frontier. Response cards can be played to either negate completely or negate partially what the other player has just done. So in this case, you can prevent one of those damage. Can't play this from hand, but you can play it from the display, and one of those damage is prevented. That's a response card. It's like an effect, can play it out of turn. There are some cards that can be played from hand during your turn rather than on the display. Most things have to be done from the display, but the exception to that are events. And events allow you to play from hand. You still have to pay the resource cost, and that could be from your display or from discarding cards or a combination. And this one here will let you take control of a Spanish card. It's probably a terrible example because there aren't any Spanish cards at the moment, but that you can then do the effect. Or for example, you can deal 1 damage to a enemy unit. In this case, the event You couldn't do the first one, so you can do the second one. If you were able to do either, you would choose one. You wouldn't do both. So in this case, you would pay the resources for the card, and then discard the card from hand, or play the card from hand to the discard pile to do what it says you can do. The final card type worth mentioning are attachments, and these are the ones I said attached to different cards. And what you do is you pay the resource cost, and they would then quite often add a attribute benefit to either the cards in the display or the cards in the frontier, and you just slide them underneath, and they would then get the additional benefit, and you can use these tokens to show what that benefit may be. A solo game of St. Elmo's Pay has its own separate rulebook, and you will play what's known as the Foe. And you can play either the Knights of St. John or the Ottoman Turks. Both sides will have a specified card setup, which you will play in order to set the game up. And it will look something like that. The player will place their leader card as normal. So far as the player turns are concerned, there is no real difference, with the exception of when you complete an objective, rather than doing the first effect, you would instead do the effect that's labelled solo, which is usually draw one card. Should you have a card in your hand that has a choice of effects, for example this one here can be a response or a solo, it's the player's choice as to which one they choose to do. The solo AI plays things slightly differently, however. The key difference really is how the resources are generated, and then what happens in terms of drawing cards and playing cards and so on. So there is this resource wheel, and depending on whether you want an easy game or an extremely difficult game, you will choose a level, and that will determine the number of resources the AI has. Any resources that are featured on the cards, for example this one here, will then be played, will count in addition to what's on the card. So for example, easy, normal and hard, the starting resources are 0, hero and epic, 1 resource, king, first round would have 2 resources. When the player plays a card, the player plays exactly the same. So for instance, if I wanted to play this card here, I could discard 2 cards as normal and place as normal. The foe, on the other hand, will, depending on what's in its deck and what you've just done, will do different things. For example, if you have sacrificed a card in your last turn, you take a second turn. If the foe has any ranged cards, it will then make a single ranged or artillery attack. So that's these cards. It will make a single attack at your forces, prioritizing any cards that with an effect labeled bold, then artillery, then range. So in this case, you would do 1 damage to this card. If there are no artillery and no ranged cards available, or no ready ranged or artillery cards available, if they're all tired, the foe will look through the deck for a card to play that is equal to or less than the resources it has available. So in those early rounds, you're looking for a card with 0, but as time goes by and you have more cards, more resources, you will find other cards coming to the fore. And you'll simply look through to see what the cost of the cards are until you find the first applicable card, and then you will play it based on what the card is and what the card tells you to do. Now in this early round you're only going to be looking for, certainly on the first few modes, you're only really going to be able to play the cards that are labelled 0. So for example we have Stout Armour, that's a 0. You would place, and that's a tactic card, so you'd place that at the back of your battlefield rows. If you have a card that is not an event and not a tactics card, you will then place on your card on the first numerical space that's not got a card in it. Now that means going from left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you place it in the first space. When it gets to the point that all the cards are full, all the spaces are full, you will carry on as before. However, what you'll do is you will, and let's move the game forward a bit, let's say we have 3 resources, enough to buy this card. What you'll do is you'll look for the first card that's not ranged or artillery and place it instead of the first lower value card in that numerical order. Should you play an event card, so those are the ones with the hourglass on, you will do the event if you can. If you cannot, you will draw again until you find a card you can play. Should you go through the entire deck without finding any cards that you can play, turn the deck over, it's then the player's turn again. The foe deals with objectives in exactly the same way, and also it will also do ranged attacks and so on in the same way, but it will prioritise those bold artillery and ranged cards wherever it can, unless the objective is the Siege of Malta. If it's at the Siege of Malta, it will not do those ranged attacks because it is trying to emphasise the amount of might and zeal it has at that point. However, it will always do artillery attacks. When a player passes, there's a process or a procedure by which you follow an end of round, and that begins with first playing each ready artillery card, then each ready ranged card. It will activate what's called the end of round abilities, which relate to bold, pulverised, relentless and tireless cards, and then it will play a single card before the play moves back to the player. Play continues as it does in the multiplayer game until one person has either won 2 of the 3 frontiers, a player has run out of cards, or a leader is killed. At the end of the solo game, there is a scoring chart that allows you to see how well you've done against the foe, whether or not you have defeated it in the battle. That's been an overview of the rules for 1565. I hope it's useful.